Hello, history nerds, and welcome back to Purple Born Histories. Today we are doing it. We are doing the big one. We are ranking every single English monarch from Alfred the Great all the way up to the late Elizabeth II. Now look, I know I'm not the first person on the internet to rate kings and queens, but I am the person with the best opinions. This is my list, my criteria, and my personal grudges, which I have a lot of. If you're a fan of King John, first of all, why are you a fan of King John? And second, feel free to argue with me in the comments. We're going from honorable mentions through worst, bad, mediocre, good, great, and finally, the GOAT. Grab a snack because we have over 1,000 years of drama to get through. Let's dive in. Before we get to the official list, we have the people who technically count, but also kind of don't. The blink and you miss them. First up is Lady Jane Grey, 1553. The 9 Days Queen. Poor Jane. She was a teenager who just wanted to read Greek and Latin, but her father-in-law, John Dudley, used her as a pawn to keep the Catholic Mary I off the throne. Jane reportedly fainted when she was told she was queen. She didn't want it, she didn't enjoy it, and eventually Mary I had her executed. A tragic pawn in a very dangerous game. Next up is Edward V, 1483. One of the princes in the tower. He was 12, never coronated, and his uncle Richard III basically said, "Actually, you're illegitimate," and locked him in the Tower of London. We never saw him again. Spoiler, Richard definitely had him killed. I do want to give a disclaimer here because I'm not English, I'm not Anglo-Saxon, obviously. Um, I'm not Danish or whatever. So some of these names coming up, and that will be way higher on the list. Um, I will probably mispronounce them. So please just bear with me. I already have trouble pronouncing just straight up English words. So trying to pronounce Danish or, Anglo-Saxon words it's a struggle. All right. Thanks for understanding, hopefully. Next is Sven Fortbeard. Awesome name, by the way. 1013 to 1014-ish. He ruled for 40 days. He was a great king of Denmark, but he basically just showed up, kicked Ethelred out, and then died suddenly. Probably from the stress of realizing how annoying England is to rule. Edgar the Etheling, 1066. The king that never was. After Hastings, the English nobles elected him, and when he saw William the Conqueror's army, he was like, "Nuh-uh, I'm out." He lived to be 70 years old, which for a 1066 claimant, that's 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 a win. Considering he outlived William the Conqueror, definitely William the Second, and I'm pretty sure if he didn't actually outlive Henry the First, he came close to it. Like he lived for because he was like 14, I think, when he got elected by the nobles, and he lived to be in his 70s or 70. That is very impressive. Alfred of Wessex, again, I probably butchered that. I apologize. 924. He died 16 days after his father. That's it. That's his reign. That's how long it was. His father went blah, and then so did he 16 days later. There's not much to say. Empress Matilda, 1141. She was the designated heir, but her cousin Stephen stole the throne. She fought a whole civil war known as the Anarchy against him. She was con- called the Lady of the English for like the people seemed to love her. I think um, she was considered Lady of the English for a bit, but never had a formal coronation. She's a badass, but technically an honorable mention. Edward the Sixth. He is technically the longest reigning monarch out of the honorable mentions. He actually did reign. He only reigned for about 6 years. He was Henry VIII's precious son, the one he waited so long to have. He was a radical Protestant puppet. He was too young to actually do anything. He was controlled by regents. Um, he died at 15 before he could really do anything besides be a bit of a religious zealot, which I don't even think that was his honest opinion, or like that wasn't something he was just taught to be. So that's why he's in the honorable mentions, despite actually reigning for 6 years. Whereas some of the ones farther down might actually have shorter reigns than him. Um, Especially one of them that I'll get to later. Um, yeah, so that's why he's up here because he was just straight up a puppet. Next is one that is probably going to be controversial. I don't know. Um, Charles III, 2022 to present. He's still technically the king as of right now. Um, if I was ranking him now, he'd be in the worst tier because of some personal issues I have with that man. But because he's still reigning, he is basically disqualified from being on the list because he's still alive and he's still reigning. So that is why he's not on the main list. That is why he's in the honorable mentions. Yeah, I like him.
Now we get into the meat of it. These are the people who actively made England worse, whether it be through malice, stupidity, or just being an awful, awful person. And the first one, if you know anything about English history, you should know who's going to be the worst out of the bunch. King John, the undisputed champion of being the worst. Like, he to me is like on the level of like Caligula or like Leopold II of Belgium, or like, say, well, Nero. He was basically England's Nero, in my opinion. This is my opinion. He lost Normandy. He tried to steal the throne from his brother Richard while Richard was doing the Crusades and he was away. He starved his prisoners, and he was so bad that his barons forced him to sign the Magna Carta, which he completely ignored. He just like signed it and went, "Yeah, I'm not following this," which then basically started an entire civil war. Um, so yeah, he was a useless man, and apparently he was just kind of a jerk anyway. Like in his personal life too, he was just a jerk. So yeah, and I would be remiss if I did not mention that he is the villain in Robin Hood. So I have to mention that. Next up is Charles the First. This man had a god complex so big, and back then it wasn't even a medical term. He thought he had a divine right to rule, um, which technically his father started. Of course, we'll talk about that later. Um, he in fact did not have divine right to rule. I just want to point that out. Um, and being that he thought he was appointed by God, he also thought he didn't need to listen to Parliament, which then started a civil war, which he lost. And he acted so smug at his trial for treason, mind you, that they just straight up said, "Yeah, no, you're done." And they beheaded him. And, like, talk about losing your head over your own ego. Like, that is the most literal version of that saying. He was so egotistical that he lost his head over it. And even as he was being defeated, he refused. Like, I don't think he would have been executed. Honestly, I don't. If he had just agreed to listen to Parliament in the first place. But he didn't. Talk about stubborn. Richard III. I don't care what the Ricardians say. He stole the throne from his nephews, locked them in the Tower of London, and they were never seen from again. He had them killed. Just straight up. And not only that, he lost his crown and the throne to a man that had a very shaky claim. Now, no hate towards Henry Tudor. We'll talk about him later. But he lost to a man that, had Richard not been such a jerk to people, and had he not, you know, overthrown that, the Tudors would have never came to be kings, because Henry had a very shaky claim. And the funny thing is that Richard ended up buried underneath a car park, um, which I find absolutely hilarious in like a really weird way. Um, they found his body, his skeleton, and I find that so funny. Edward II. Edward had favorites, Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser being the two most famous. Um, a lot of people thought that both of them were his lovers, including his wife. His wife believed that. A funny alleged claim here is that during the, like, right after the royal wedding between him and Isabella, supposedly, instead of having Isabella sit next to him like you would have normally done, he had Piers Gaveston sit next to him. People believe that he was lovers with him, and that's why he was one of the favorites. Some people also think that Despenser was also one of his lovers. Um, he was a very weak king and was eventually deposed by his wife Isabella, also known as the She-Wolf of France, which, by the way, is so badass. And her lover Mortimer, who that name just sounds like an evil person. Um, and of course, there's the famous legend that he was killed by having a red hot poker shoved up his backside. So that, if true, is a horrible way to die, especially for a royal. James the Second and Seventh. He's a king that tried to force England back into Catholicism, even though like a majority of England at that point had became Protestant. Um, Everyone was so over Catholicism at the time, and because his brother Charles II, who again we'll get to much later, he had no kids, or at least no, you know, legitimate kids. So James was next in line, and everybody knew that he was Catholic, but they didn't think that he would go so far as to try to force England back into it. Um, he was so unpopular that his own daughter Mary and her husband, his son-in-law, and I believe they were cousins too, which, eh, that's messed up. But I'm not getting into that. William overthrew him. He then, as he was being overthrown, as the Glorious Revolution was happening, he threw the Great Seal into the River Thames and ran away to France, where he lived out pretty much all of his life after that. Technically, there is a claimant, like a group of claimants, that say that technically they're the rightful monarchs to England. I don't know if any of them are still alive or not, though, but they claim that they're the rightful kings because James was the rightful king, and George II even fought some of them during his reign. So yeah. Edwig. Supposedly, at his own coronation feast, he snuck off to have a private moment, if you catch my drift, with two women who just happened to be a mother and a daughter, which is weird. Um, he was found and dragged back. He also had an incident where he stripped the land from St. Dunstan, which I probably butchered that name. Um, the church then hated him forevermore after that. Next is William II Rufus. Apparently, he was called Rufus. I just found this out. Apparently, he was called Rufus because he supposedly had like really messy, like ginger hair. So supposedly that's where that came from. Anyway, he was a very rude, greedy king who really hated the church. Um, he had a massive power struggle against his older brother Robert, who was like king of Normandy, I think. Um, because it was like the oldest son of William the Conqueror got like the Norman side, and then the second oldest, which was William, got England. So it was that kind of situation. Um, and eventually he was accidentally shot with an arrow while hunting, and everyone basically went, "Oh no!" Anyway, yeah, apparently his brother rushed to the castle after William was killed. You know, Henry I rushed to the castle and was basically like, I I want the throne. And they're basically just like, okay, okay, you can have it. They didn't even really investigate what happened. They just say hunting accident. That's how hated that man was. Henry VI. This guy was just not fit for the job. He had mental health collapses and was a puppet to literally everyone around him. He's the Englishman that officially lost the 100 Years' War. Um, and he's also the same Henry that started the War of the Roses, technically. Um, I don't really know if you can really blame him for some of those things, considering that he was a very nice guy. He just wasn't mentally there. He was eventually murdered in the tower after the throne being taken away from him. Um, by Edward the Fourth, I believe. Um, he was eventually murdered in a tower, possibly by being suffocated by a pillow. That's what's believed. We don't know if that actually happened or if that's just a myth or whatever. Stephen, he spent his entire reign fighting Matilda in the anarchy. He was a decent guy, but a terrible king. He couldn't keep order, like, at all. Period. Like, everything was going to hell. When his own son died, he just gave up and named Matilda's son Henry his heir because he had nobody else to give it to. So he fought that war only for Matilda's family to end up taking the throne anyway, eventually. So, like, he fought an entire anarchy against a woman and nearly lost a few times. Um, for no reason because her family ended up taking charge anyway. So, nice guy or decent guy, but just not a very good king. Edward VIII, the man who quit. He abdicated the throne to Mary Wallace Simpson, a twice divorced American. This caused a massive constitutional crisis, which then led to his brother, which I will admit he was a way better king than I think Edward ever would have been. Um, but to make matters even worse, he was almost most certainly a Nazi sympathizer. With one reported, like one report actually saying that apparently at some point one of the Nazis, and I don't remember who it was, said that they wish that Edward was king and not George. To which apparently Edward smiled and agreed. So yeah, there's that. Now take that with a grain of salt. That's just a supposed thing that was said. George the Fourth, the ultimate prince regent. He spent millions of pounds on palaces and clothes while the people were starving. He treated his wife, Carolina Brunswick, horribly. He couldn't stand her. If you've ever watched Horrible Histories, there's a song dedicated to this, and it's not that far off of his thoughts of his own wife. Could not stand her. Had like constant like mistresses, and he literally locked her out of his coronation because he didn't want her anywhere around him during that. And when he did eventually die, which was like 10 years after he became king, because his father reigned for so long, he only got like 10 years as king. Though technically he was like rolling part-time anyway. Anyway, so when he did eventually die, literally nobody mourned him. The people couldn't stand him. Parliament couldn't stand him. Ethelred the Unready. Unready in this case actually means badly advised or ill advised. He tried to pay off the Vikings. But newsflash, if you give a bully your lunch money, he just comes back the next day for more. So that's exactly what they did. Um, yeah, so he was eventually like overthrown or usurped, and after Sven died, he came back for a second reign, which was also pretty short. Um, then he was eventually just kicked out permanently. Um, Yeah, he was not a good king. He just thought that, like, giving in to their wants would, like, save them, which it did not, because, like I said, you give bullies your lunch money and they're just gonna come back for more. Harthacnut. He was so petty that when he took the throne, he dug up his half brother Harold Harefoot's body, put it on trial, and beheaded the corpse. Talk about sibling rivalry. Like, that's that's some Game of Thrones crap right there. That sounds like it would be perfectly paired with Game of Thrones. Um he died at a wedding while drinking, and the English people were basically just like, "Oh, thank God he's gone." Now, I will say that there was one kind of okay thing he did where he allowed his other half brother, um Edward the Confessor, to come back to England after he had been kicked out. So I guess if you could name like one good thing that he did, it'd be that, because while Edward Confessor isn't the greatest king out there, he was a lot better than Harthacnut was. So Edward the Martyr. He was a teenager who was stabbed in the back while getting a drink of water, likely on the orders of his stepmother, so her son Ethelred could be king. That is not a very good way to go. He was just so young, and he was attacked and killed and murdered, and by somebody he normally should have been able to trust. But we'll learn that during these times, you could trust absolutely nobody. These guys weren't necessarily disasters, but they weren't exactly King of the Year material either. Henry VIII. I know, he founded the Royal Navy, he reformed the church, but I hate him. I hate him so much. He was a narcissistic, wife killing, gluttonous tyrant who broke the country because he wanted a divorce. When when the Reformation happened, it was, I guess, in the long run, an okay thing, because I'm not going to get into that. Um, but it would cause years and years of just religious wars because of a decision he made so that he could get a son, which we saw up above that was not the greatest monarch. Not all on his fault, but that's beside the point. Um, he ruined the monasteries and destroyed priceless history. 0 stars. Can't stand this man. Also, if you want to like ever get like a very funny view of like the Six Wives, check out the songs from Six the Musical. Perfect. Love that musical. One of my favorites. Yes, I'm a theater kid, if you couldn't tell. Harold Harefoot. His name is the coolest thing about him. He was a placeholder king who didn't do much besides annoy his relatives. Absolutely pathetic. As we saw above, Harthacnut took that to heart and put him on trial after his death, after he had died, and beheaded him. So apparently he really peeved some people off. Harold Godwinson. He had the worst luck in history. He won a massive battle at Stamford Bridge, had to march the entire length of England, and then lost at Hastings. And then, of course, there's the rumor that he took an arrow to the eye. Definitely not the best way to be remembered as somebody that won a battle and then, like, a few months later, or however long it actually was, to get beat in another battle and die. Especially with an arrow through the eye. You just know that had to hurt. George the First. He was German, did not speak much English, and didn't really care to learn it either. He preferred to spend his time in Hanover, which is pretty much where he's from. That's why they were known as the Hanoverians. Um, he was essentially like a royal absentee landlord. Like he had control, but not really, because during this time is the time that prime ministers became a thing. Um, Robert Walpole, Sir Robert Walpole, probably butchered that, um, was the first prime minister. Um, though technically he did not use that name, he held the terms or the positions of First Lord of the Treasury, Chancellor of Exchequer, I don't know what that is, and leader of the House of Commons. But that what he held would later just become known as prime minister, which is what we have or what they have today. So, yeah, that's how little he actually cared to rule. He put somebody else in charge. Though some people actually believe that he was manipulated, especially if you watch Horrible Histories. And there's an entire joke in there about how because he didn't speak much English, he didn't understand. Um, and it was actually believed that when George II became king, that the entire like prime minister thing would be dropped. It was not, obviously. Um, Walpole actually is the longest serving prime minister of all time in England. Just a little fun fact there. Richard First, the Lionheart. People love him because of Robin Hood, but he was a terrible English king. He was only in the country about 6 months of his 10-year reign. He used England as a piggy bank to fund his crusades, and once said he would have sold London if he could find a buyer. Now, obviously, while being a way better king than, say, John, because he didn't just like outright harm people or like outright really disrespect anybody, he is definitely not the like noble ruler of England. He was a much better crusader than he, like, much better general than he ever was a king. Considering, like I said, he only spent like 6 months of his 10-year reign actually in England. And that was like the very beginning of his reign before he started on his crusades. Also, he died, and this is kind of sad. He died in France from a um, arrow, and he died in his mother Eleanor of Aquitaine's arms while she cried, which is really sad. Also, I might do an entire solo video on Eleanor of Aquitaine because I love her so much. So, yeah. James First and Sixth. He was smart, the wisest fool in Christendom, but he was paranoid, hated baths, and set the stage for the Civil War by arguing for the divine rights of kings. He's the king that would later cause Charles I, his son, to be executed. Because while Charles himself also held those beliefs, who do you think taught him those beliefs? He was taught by James that they had the absolute right to rule, which is one of the reasons that James is in the bad category. Um, and the thing is that he was he was Protestant. His wife was Catholic. He married a Catholic. He didn't specifically hate Catholics, like most of the Protestants would and did, until he was almost killed in a gunpowder plot. Because that was set up by a bunch of Catholics and he grew to absolutely hate them. Um, yeah, so that he like did a complete 180 on that, which I mean, while kind of understandable, I don't think you should hate an entire religious group because some radicals decided to try to kill you. George III. He is, of course, famously known as the king who lost America. To be fair, he had a mental illness. But his reign saw the loss of the colonies and a lot of internal strife. He, by the end of his life, he didn't recognize anybody. He's the reason that his son, George, was known for being the prince regent because he was not mentally fit like most of the time. Like sometimes he'd be perfectly fine, and then others he'd be absolutely out of his mind. Um, it's I believe it's called porphyria is what he had. Um, so yeah, that's why he's here. Not necessarily because he lost America. Mainly he's here because he was mentally ill and couldn't remember anything by the end, and it's actually kind of sad. Mary the First, or Bloody Mary. She gets a lot of hate for burning 280 Protestants. I mean, yeah, that's obviously a bad thing to do. However, her father, Henry VIII, killed thousands more than what she did. And he's nowhere near as detested, which I find, obviously people don't like him, but he doesn't have a name like Bloody Henry or something. Unlike Mary, who only killed only, it's still a lot of people, but only killed 280, where he killed thousands. And in her case, she was just a woman trying to do what she thought was right at a very violent time, caused by her father with his religious reformation, um, which caused a split in the church, obviously. Um, However, she was still not a very good monarch. And I think one of the reasons that I have her in the very end of the bad tier, is because she didn't reign very long. She reigned for like 3 years, I think. And she couldn't have kids, which I find really sad actually, because one of the things she wanted in her life was to have kids. And the one time she actually thought she was pregnant, turns out she had ovarian cancer. And that's actually really, really sad. So yeah, another thing I'm not a big fan of hers about is that she locked up her own sister. Um, that being Elizabeth the First, or who would become Elizabeth the First. Um, at the very beginning of her reign, because I think maybe she thought that Elizabeth would try to overthrow her. Um, I don't think Elizabeth actually had any plans. I think it was accusations. I'm not sure if there was any actual plans going on there. But yeah, I'm not a fan of her because of that. But she shouldn't be known as this absolute horrible person compared to her father, who did a lot worse. And who doesn't have a name like Bloody Henry or Henry the Madman, which would be very fitting. These are the monarchs who were fine. They didn't burn the house down, but they didn't build a new wing either. Henry III. He reigned for a long time, 56 years, which at that point in time, that was a long time. He built Westminster Abbey, which is great. That great thing that he did. But he was also pretty weak and let the barons walk all over him. And I think the thing with the barons with him, you can't blame that all on him. His father being John kind of left him in a very bad spot. Where, with his father not following the Magna Carta, that kind of screwed over like Henry real bad. Because the barons already couldn't stand him just because of who his father was. And then he didn't do himself any favors either by just being like, yeah, okay, y'all can do what y'all want. Instead of trying to, like, I don't know, fight back. I wouldn't really say fight back, but like stand his ground. But other than that, he was fine, I guess. He was okay. Edward the Confessor. While I like him personally, because he was a very pious man and built the original Westminster Abbey, he failed to leave an heir, which led directly to the chaos in 1066. He was a great guy, absolutely great guy. Just a really mediocre king because of him not having an heir. Um, so that is why he is like right here in the mediocre tier, because while being such a pious and just great guy personally, he just would later, through really no fault of his own, because I mean, some people just can't have kids, um, would later cause all the secession crisis and everything that was going on in 1066, which would lead to the Norman conquests and everything. So yeah. George II. To me, the biggest like thing about George II is that he was the last British monarch to lead his troops into battle at the Battle of Dettingen, which I probably butchered that. He was a bit of a hothead, but he kept the seat warm. He was just kind of there. With him being the last British monarch to actually lead troops, that's pretty significant. So that's why he's not like in the bad tier. Other than that, he was just kind of there. Um, Apparently, him and his father fought like a lot. They couldn't stand each other, which I find a little funny. William IV, known as the Sailor King, he was a bit eccentric, but he stayed out of the way and let the Reform Act of 1832 pass. That being the act that stopped slavery in the UK. Um, he's also known as being the father of one of the greatest queens in all of world history, in my opinion. Um, See, another thing about him, this is a story that I find way funnier than it should be. Apparently, he got mad at Parliament one time and disappeared for like, I think it was a week or so. Um, he went sailing to cool off from being so angry at him. And they actually got worried and was setting up his succession already. Um, because he just disappeared. And if that's a true story, that is absolutely hilarious. And just to think that a king's like, yeah, no, I need to breathe. And instead of just having the person like executed or assassinated, he just leaves. George V, known as the king from World War One, because that's what he was. He was just steady, boring, and did exactly what a constitutional monarch was supposed to do: look grumpy and stay quiet. That's exactly what he was meant to do. That was his job. There was no him, commanding armies even from afar. He was just kind of there. Um, he was a figurehead, so there's not much more to say about him. Besides the fact that his wife, Mary of Teck, is one of my favorite like queen consorts of all time. I love her story, and maybe one day I might do a standalone video on her too, because I really, really like her. Now we're getting into the B students. These people actually did a decent job of being monarchs. Henry IV. He had the difficult task of usurping the throne from Richard II, and then spending his entire reign trying to prove that he deserved to be there. Of which he did succeed on proving that he deserved to be there. Um, there's not much to say about him other than Richard really pissed him off by taking the inheritance that Henry rightfully deserved, just to spite him, which is actually what led to Henry saying, "Yeah, no, you take my inheritance, I'm gonna take your throne." Petty family squabbles in like the worst way. This is like, again, Game of Thrones level stuff. Edmund II Ironside. Side note, not in my script here. Ironside is such a cool like epithet. It's so awesome sounding. Okay. He fought the Vikings so hard that even Canute the Great was impressed. When Canute is impressed, that's very impressive. He only lost because he was betrayed. A lot of people think, a lot of historians I've heard think that he probably would have beat the Vikings if he had not been betrayed. Like I said, Canute actually was really impressed with Edmund. He was a real like good leader, and even the people, for the most part, really liked him. Edred. He finally kicked the Vikings out for good, which, considering how much damage the Vikings caused, just in general, to like the normal people, that was considered a really good thing for him to do. He was a very solid warrior king too. Henry I, one of the most educated kings. He was nicknamed Beauclerc. He was a master of administration and kept England stable for a whole 35 years. And considering like how normally they were very unstable, in fact, you know, not that long before then was the whole Norman takeover, and his older brother wasn't a very good king. So, considering he actually managed to keep it stable for 35 years, that's very impressive. Queen Anne. She oversaw the Act of Union, which is what was signed to actually create Great Britain. It's like Ireland, like Northern Ireland, and Scotland, Wales, and England. I think that's all the countries that's inside of that. I might be wrong. Um, and she did that, she oversaw that while also suffering. She suffered so much. She lost all of her 17 children, yet still managed to rule effectively during the War of the Spanish Succession. She managed to rule through all of that. I think the only son to survive like infanthood or even like young childhood, died of what I believe it was said tuberculosis, probably. Um, when he was 11. I think he was 11 when he died. And another thing is that when Anne died, she was apparently as wide as she was tall. She overindulged apparently, and that's one of the things that ended up killing her when she did die. Mary the Second and William the Third. Of course, I'm putting these two together because they were the only actual co-monarchs of England. Um, they're known as the Glorious Revolution duo. They were the ones that took over and basically usurped um James the Second, who was Mary's father. Um, they signed the Bill of Rights, which basically created like the modern British government. So basically, the government that England has now, or Britain has now, was basically created by them when they signed off on the Bill of Rights. Um, and it's really not bad for a couple that took the throne from their own father and father-in-law. So that they did pretty good considering that they technically wasn't I guess supposed to, because James had a kid at that point, had a boy who was Catholic, which is one of the reasons that the Glorious Revolution happened. These are the icons, the ones who defined eras. William the Conqueror. He changed England forever. He brought the French language to England. He brought castles to England, and he created the Doomsday Book. He was a brutal conqueror, but we all can't deny his impact. The English that is spoken in England now is a direct consequence of him, because it has French in it as well, as opposed to the old Anglo-Saxon way of speaking or spelling or anything. Because he brought French to England, then now the English language is more French than it is Anglo-Saxon. Edmund the First. Not much to say besides the fact that he was a great military leader who expanded the kingdom. Really good military leader. There's not much more to really say than that. That's pretty much the reason he's here, because he managed to expand the kingdom, and he was just a really good military leader. Edgar the Peaceful. His reign was a very rare moment of peace, which you should be able to tell that it was peaceful because of his epithet. Um, it was a very rare moment of like peace and prosperity in Saxon England, um, which pretty much ended as soon as he died. Like he died and it was over. Edward the First, Longshanks. And yes, this is the villain from Braveheart. But for England, he was a powerhouse. He was also incredibly tall, which is what long shakes mean. I think it means like long legs or something like that. Um, he was just so like massive. He would have been like tall for this day and age. Back then, he was a beast. He also established the model parliament, and he was also a very brilliant military strategist. Charles II, also known as the Merry Monarch. After the drudgery of Cromwell, which obviously is not on this list because he wasn't a king, he was a Lord Protector, so he's not on this list. He brought back theater, parties, and fun. He survived the Great Fire and the Plague. And also, if you ever want to check out another thing from Horrible Histories that's absolutely hilarious, you should check out his song. It's so good. It's really a banger. Edward the Fourth. He was a giant of a man, but a very brilliant general who mostly won the Wars of the Roses. He was also a very notorious womanizer, which obviously caused drama, but he brought a lot of stability after a time of not being stable at all. Also, he was married to Elizabeth Woodville, who's like, again, one of my favorite women ever. I think she was amazing, even though people called her a witch. Um, she was absolutely great. I love her so much. Edward III. He started the 100 Years' War, founded the Order of the Garter, and had a fascinating personal life. He reigned for 50 years and made England a superpower. With his wife, he absolutely loved her. Um, like they are one royal couple that was genuinely in love with each other. By the end of his life, he did get a mistress, which I think was his only mistress that he ever had throughout his entire life. Um, Also, he is the one that had his mother, who overthrown, as I mentioned earlier, overthrown his overthrew his father. Um, Exiled, and his mother's lover Mortimer killed when he got in charge and wasn't just being like controlled. Um, and while him starting the 100 Years' War would later like backfire for England, bad. He actually won most of the battles he was a member of. Like they won most of their battles when he was in charge. He 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 did become a little less involved the older he got, but that could have been down to health issues because it's believed that what killed him was possibly a stroke and that by the end of his life he possibly had dementia. Henry VII. He was literally the ultimate accounting king. He won at Bosworth, ended the Wars of the Roses, and left the treasury full, only for his son to later blow it on gold armor and wives. Um, he really did leave the treasury like completely slam packed full. He didn't mess around when it came to money. He became basically a millionaire. What would be considered a millionaire today, anyway. Um, he famously married his own cousin, which, thinking back, that was very normal for that time period for people to do that. Um, what isn't normal for people to do was now he did do the normal thing of like marrying her for political reasons to try to get like the Yorkists and the Lancaster side of the family into one big happy family, I guess. But he actually loved her. He loved Elizabeth of York. And when she died, he mourned her pretty much for the rest of his life. He refused to marry again. Um, there was a short time where I think that he was gonna try to marry Catherine of Aragon after Arthur died. But other than that, like he just purely, absolutely loved her. Edward the Elder, Alfred the Great's son. He continued his father's work and conquered almost all of the Danelaw. He's often overlooked, but he was vital. Honestly, yeah, he's been like up until like a few years ago, he was very overlooked. Um he was always in his father's shadow, and while Alfred the Great, who's higher up on this list, was great, Edward was also a very good king. Edward VII, known as the Uncle of Europe. He was a diplomat who helped create the Entente Cordiale, which I probably butchered, with France. That's pretty much all I got to say about him. He was he was a good diplomat. George VI, in my opinion, the best George. Um, he was a king who didn't want to be a king. However, after his brother abdicated, he became king anyway. He over he overcame his stutter that he had, and even stayed in London during the Blitz, and became a symbol of British resilience during the war. He also sent his daughter Elizabeth to work for the military, like as a military mechanic, I think it was, and that made like the people that knew about that very like supportive of them. He also took the same rationing and restrictions that the people had, which was like uncommon for monarchs in any country to do that. He was a very, despite not being like actually truly in charge because he was a constitutional monarch. He was what any figurehead monarch should strive to be because he suffered with his people and he didn't run away when things got hard, which is all you can hope for in a monarch. Here we go. The top tier, the legends. Ethelstan, the first true king of all England. He won the Battle of Brunanburh, which is arguably the most important battle you've ever heard of. He was a scholar and a warrior. The father of English common law. He ruled a very massive empire, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. He was an energetic, brilliant man who was only held back by his dramatic family. Looking at you, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Just kidding. I love you, girl. Yeah, so pretty much all his sons, including his favorite, Richard, betrayed him. I think the only one that didn't actively betray him, and I might be wrong about this, was Henry the Young King. And I think that's only because he died at a very young age, despite being Henry's co ruler. So, like, technically they did co rule, but I don't think it was considered official. Of course, Eleanor of Aquitaine married Henry, mainly to get away from Henry's brother, and that's like a whole situation I'm not getting into. Um, so she married him, and they had like a ton of kids. Like so many girls, so many boys. It was a very big family. And like I said, all the boys I think just like started rebelling against their own father. Talk about like rebellious teenagers. Though like most of them I don't think were teenagers, but you get my point. Canute the Great, a Viking who was actually a better king of England than most Englishmen. He was wise, powerful, and respected the English laws and the English religion. He didn't try to make everybody like a pagan. He didn't try to do all that. He just kind of let everybody live their life, even though he was a Viking. He was just a much better king than literally almost any other Englishman at that time could have been or was. Alfred the Great, the only English monarch called the Great, he saved Wessex from the Vikings, promoted literacy, and laid the foundations for the entire country. England would not In fact, we would not be here if it was not for Alfred. He is honestly probably the greatest king in Europe, like in European history, not just English history, European history. Because, like I said, if it wasn't for him, honestly, I don't think England would be where it is. We probably wouldn't exist like we do. And even France, I don't think would be like it is today if it was not for Alfred. Queen Victoria, she defined an entire century. She had an entire era named after her, the Victorian era. She oversaw the expansion of the British Empire and became the grandmother of Europe. She sent like all her kids to go get married in different countries. The most famous thing about her is that she was married to her cousin, who she deeply was devoted to. She loved her husband so much. Um, when he died, she pretty much pulled herself from like the she pretty much pulled herself from like the public and wore a mourning dress, a mourning, not mourning as in you know what I mean. Um, pretty much the rest of her life, from the time he died to the time she died. Speaking of her death, it was most likely a stroke and definitely stress related. And also probably weight related too, though that has not been confirmed. But it was believed that she had a stroke while having a screaming match with somebody. Which, yeah, I could believe it. Elizabeth the First. Now, most people would have her at like number one, and I don't. And some people might be like, well, why don't you have her at number one? You'll see. Anyway, she is known as the Virgin Queen because she never got married, never had any kids or anything. I don't think it literally means that she was a virgin because it said that she did have lovers, but she just never married, never had any kids. She took a divided, bankrupt country and turned it into a golden age of literature, exploration, and let's not forget the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Henry V, the Warrior King, Agincourt. That's all I need to say. He almost became King of France, too. If only he hadn't died of dysentery at the height of his power. He probably would have became King of France. Technically, he had Charles the Mad sign over the throne to his son. So, I mean. And finally, we are at the very last person. And y'all may already know who it is without me even having to say anything. Elizabeth II. I love her. She was the longest reigning monarch, a symbol of stability through 70 years of world shattering change. She was honestly the new, like, nation's grandmother and handled the job with more grace than anyone else in history. And this may be very biased because she was the queen during my lifetime. She's the only queen of England up until 2021, 2022, when she died, that I knew. She was Queen of England when I was born in 2002. So pretty much for 20 odd years, 20 plus years, she was the only Queen of England I knew. And I honestly really, really liked her. I like some of the stories that's told about her. That's really fun. And she honestly, to be a queen, for the most part, seemed really down to earth. And just like somebody's grandmother that you'd see in the street. And that's why she is my pick for the greatest English monarch in all of history. Obviously, not to mention that she holds the record for, like, I think she's the second in line now for the longest reigning monarch ever. Of course, being beat by Louis the Sun King. Um, for all those reasons that I just listed, is the reasons that she is my pick for the greatest English monarch, and honestly, one of the greatest European monarchs of all time, not just of the modern age, of all time. And that's it. Every English monarch ranked. I'm exhausted. You're probably angry about my Henry VIII ranking, my Richard the Lionheart, my Alfred the Great, my Elizabeth I ranking. However, we just went through 1,100 years of history. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Purple Born Histories and stay nerdy, my friends. Love you.